Welcome back to the studio, everyone. I'm Eric C. Jackson. I'm going over some photographs for the portfolio, and I wanted to talk to you guys a little bit about enlarging the prints. It's something that I do quite often, but there's different ways to enlarge your photographs. Now, the base size or dimensions of your photograph, for me, it's a 12-inch by 18-inch. And so you can use, I believe you can use Lightroom, but I basically use Photoshop and Adobe Camera Raw. But there's different, softwares that you guys use. Now, if you're going to use Adobe, then for me, I prefer Camera Raw because you're dealing with the negative file, the negative digital file, which is the raw file. And I just feel like that's the better way to enlarge my prints. I've tried it both ways with doing the enlargements in Photoshop and then comparing it to the enlargements in Camera Raw. And I just find that the Camera Raw photos, once you enlarge it, there's a lot less noise, there's less color aberrations. And so I'm going to show you guys what I do in order to enlarge my prints. Now, the other reason that I do this technique as well is because if you're taking a lot of photographs for several years, you're going to need a lot of hard drive space. And so I do want to keep a Photoshop file on my external hard drives, but I don't want the file to be like a large print size, right? So I go through my routine on every print, and I'm just going to show you guys what I do. All right, so we're going to go to the ACES screen. Let me go ahead and switch my window. All right, we're at the ACES screen, and I'm going to work on this one. This is Emulate. I captured this one in September 2023. And the thing that I want to do is, like I said, is enlarge the prints. Now, here's the raw file, which I have all of my raw files labeled in blue. So that's the raw file. This is the Photoshop file, which I have all my labels in purple. Now, as far as file management, I use Adobe Bridge. I'm not sure what you guys use is as far as file management, but this has been what I've been using since 2008. So I'm used to understanding where everything is. But I'm going to go ahead and open up the file in Photoshop. And yes, they just gave us another update recently at Photoshop. It uses more memory, so hopefully you guys set up as far as your computer specs are beefy enough for this. All right, so here's the file. Now, what you look down here in the corner here is the file size is 18.72 inch by 12.48. So that's basically what you're going to capture in camera. And you can also see that from, I'll go, Command Option I, and you'll see it here. That's your file size. Now, I usually go in inches. You can also go in pixels, but the resolution is 300. And so for my Photoshop files, that's what I use, right? But when I want to create my print file, I'm going to need something a lot bigger than a 12 by 18 print size. So I want to blow this up or enlarge it, I should say, to a 40 by 60. Now, if you're going to do this in Photoshop, I would say go to your resample and switch your option to preserve details enlargement. Switch it to that. Reduce noise. I always have it as 100%. And obviously, once you enlarge the print, you're going to see any type of grain, noise, color aberrations. You're going to see that all of that even more, which is why you want to try to make sure that your exposures are correct when you're initially capturing the photograph. But that's what you would have: preserve details, enlargement, and you just, let me change my width to 60, and the ratio is locked, and so 60 inches wide, 40 inches high. That's going to be my print file size, and then keep the resolution at 300 pixels per inch. And that's just to make sure that even though you're enlarging it quite a bit, your clarity is going to stay, the quality of the photograph is going to stay where it needs to be. So just click OK. It goes through the process, and it's going to enlarge the file pretty big. So now you've got a giant photograph. And usually what I would do is just check over it to make sure there's not anything that I want to use the healing brush for, to get rid of anything that looks weird. Okay, so there's that. So now what I'm going to do is go back to Adobe Bridge. I'm going to go to the raw file, and I'm going to go ahead and open that up in Camera Raw. All right, so for this particular photograph, I didn't do any major edits directly in Camera Raw, which you can. The settings are pretty much similar to what you see in Lightroom over here, but I didn't do any edits in Camera Raw with this one. But what I did do, if you want to enlarge it, you come down to the very bottom down here, and you'll see the Adobe RGB 1998. You'll click on that on the text, and then up pops the dialog box. Now for me, I have the channel as 16 bits instead of 8, which it holds more information. My color space, Adobe RGB 1998, which I've been using that for years. And then I select the resize to fit, because you'll see image size in here. Then you'll click this box, resize to fit. And then for me, I just put 60 by 60. It's automatically going to keep the original ratio, so it's going to come out to a 60 by 40. Again, the resolution is going to stay up at 300 pixels per inch. And then also when you open this up in Photoshop, make sure that you have this selected, open in Photoshop as a smart object. What that allows you to do is to come back into Camera Raw. Even after you open it up in Photoshop, you're still able to make edits. And I believe that you have like more editing options with the smart object selected. So I always have that checked. And then you just come up here and you click OK. So now when you open the file from Camera Raw, you have open object down here in the corner. And it's opening up the raw file. And it's just spinning here, because now I've got some things going on. Okay, so I've got too much software open because I'm doing this on OBS, but that's the way that you would do it. You would open it up on here, and I would come over here under layers. I would take the signature layer that's over here, and then I would take the levels and I would select that as well. Yeah, it's not letting me do anything. But I would take these two layers and now I drag them over to the raw file. And then make sure before you drop it, you hold down the shift key so that the signature and the levels layer will drop, directly on it as it is. It'll just be like the placement will be exactly where it's supposed to be. Because I'm going to drag the signature and the levels layer over to the raw file, hold down shift, and then you drop it. And so then the signature is going to drop in the exact same place it is by holding down the shift key. But yeah, that's how I would do it. So on all of my files, that's really what I'm doing. Is I'll open up the 12x18 in Photoshop. And then in Photoshop, I'll enlarge it to the 60x40. But this is not the file that I'm going to use to send to the photo lab. I'm going to open up the raw file, enlarge that to 60x40, and then I'm going to drag these two layers over to it, and it'll be another tab here. Drag it over to that layer, and then that's the file that I'm going to send, because I didn't do the enlargement or create the enlargement in Photoshop. That enlargement is created or was created in Adobe Camera Raw. And like I said, you can either do it directly from Photoshop or you can do it that way from Camera Raw. But yeah, for me, I definitely prefer the Camera Raw version for sure. So now it goes back down to the 12x18 version. Let me see if I can open this now so you guys can see what I'm talking about. Okay, no, I won't be able to do that. All right, my only other option to try out really quickly, if I take the resize off and then open. Yeah, it's still too full. All right. But that's my workflow of what I do in terms of print enlargement. Like I said, you can go directly in Photoshop or you can go through Camera Raw. It just depends on what you're comfortable with. I know some photographers, they don't like the extra steps. For me, I'm really picky about the quality of the print, making sure I can get the best one possible. But yeah, that's basically what I do, and I have to do that for practically all the photos. Now, if you're capturing photography with your camera settings in auto, you're not going to have access to a raw file, because the auto function on your camera is just going to give you a JPEG. Unless I believe you can go to settings and add a raw file to it, but it's natively going to give you a JPEG file. And if you are photographing with your camera only capturing a JPEG, you really narrow. You really put yourself in a bad place where you really can't enlarge the file at all. It's gonna be stuck at a 12x18 if that's the original file size. Only if you use a raw, what they call a digital negative, can you enlarge it without worried about your photograph being pixelated. because you're stretching it out. When it's still a raw digital negative, it's like all the information is not set in stone yet until you convert it to a JPEG or a PNG or a TIFF, whatever file type you use. Then everything is set in stone. So what I like to do is when it's still a raw file, go ahead and enlarge it. A lot of times I do my editing, most of it in Camera Raw, and then I bring it into Photoshop, do any extra cleaning up with the healing brush tool. Sometimes it's some dodging and burning that I want to do. I'll do that in Photoshop, but I want to make sure that when I'm enlarging it, I want to do that in Camera Raw as much as possible. And then I'll export it through Photoshop. Now, if it's a photograph that's really clean and you don't need to clean it up as far as dodging, burning, spot healing, if you don't need to do any of that in Photoshop, you can export it directly in Camera Raw. And it won't be a problem. You can export it as a JPEG, PNG, TIFF, etc. Now, even with that, there is a difference between the two. If you export a file in Camera Raw, you can take that same file, export it in Photoshop, and you're going to get slightly different looks as far as tonal range, especially with the black and white photography. So keep all of that in mind. I would basically test it and see what you get on the export as well. See how the pictures look. So you can do the enlargement and the export in Photoshop, do the enlargement and the export in Camera Raw, compare the two of them and see which one you like the best. You're going to check for the camera noise, the color aberration, the tonal range, the tonal shifts that you can get, and just compare them and see what you like, right? And I think especially for the black and whites, for me, it just seems like the tonal range is a little bit better coming out of Camera Raw opposed to Photoshop. But again, if you have to do a lot of editing, especially if you got to go into dodging and burning, it's going to be a lot harder to do that in Camera Raw compared to how easy it is to do that in Photoshop. But that's my advice and a little tip that I wanted to give you guys. And I do apologize I wasn't able to show like how I drag and drop the layers in Photoshop to the Camera Raw file. So hopefully you guys got the gist of that. But that's what I'm working on, especially going into this weekend, to make sure that the print files being uploaded to the website are the way that they need to be. All right, so thank you guys for tuning in. I really appreciate it. Take care.